Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to invite you to this discussion, Strategizing for Climate Justice, a conversation with Indigenous youth activists, which is taking place during Earth Week. My name is Patsy Lewis, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Brown University, and senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International, National and Public Affairs, in which CLACS is located. Climate change is the urgent issue of our time. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports establish conclusively that climate change is man-made and that these changes are unprecedented over thousands of years. We are also not in a position to meet our commitments to reducing greenhouse gases. They have also established that the effects of climate change are not something that's futuristic, but we are already experiencing these in most inhabited areas of the world, as we see extreme temperatures, heat waves more frequent and intensified, more intense hurricanes, heavy rainfall, drought, fires, that some of these changes that we are experiencing, especially those related to warming sea temperatures, are irreversible. We also know that the climate crisis reflects deep inequities at the levels of causation, effects, and resources to combat these effects. These are reflected in the degree of energy consumption by economic sectors, geography, urban versus rural, categories of states, class, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. So it's very timely for us to have this discussion. And unfortunately, a disproportionate burden of climate change will fall on the young. So we are particularly pleased to have three young Indigenous activists, Ruth, Andrea, and Sequoia, to talk to us through these issues today. And I would like to especially acknowledge the work of Kristen, Kolenz, a postdoctoral fellow here at CLACS, and Emily Rockwell, a student at Brown, in conceptualizing and pulling this discussion together. Before I hand over to Kristen and Emily, I would like to thank Kate at CLACS, as well as the Watson Communications team, who are helping us to anchor this event today. Turn you over to Kristen.
Thanks so much, Patsy, and I am so happy to be here today and to be in community with you all. I'm going to share a quick introduction for our event that was prepared by my co-organizer, Emily Rockwell. And just quickly, I want to tell you all about this amazing person, Emily Rockwell, that I've been working with. She's a senior here at Brown, and she's studying international and public affairs with a focus on environmental law and policy. She's worked on the Cost of War project, where she examined post 9/11 US military activity, and at the Climate and Development Lab, where she researched the role of public relations firms in obstructing climate action. And I'm very excited to share with y'all that she'll be graduating this spring and will be joining the Environmental Law Institute as a research associate. So I've been so lucky to work with Emily on this event, and someone who is so dedicated to research and action around climate justice. And so I'm going to share with y'all an introduction that she is unexpectedly unable to share with you. So I'm going to go ahead and read what she's prepared. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. And as we sit here today in April 2022, the stakes could not be higher. The 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report reiterates once again that the window of opportunity to secure a livable future for life on this planet is rapidly closing, like Patsy shared with us. Indeed, many people do not need this report to remind them of this reality, as populations around the world are continuing to suffer from increasingly severe natural disasters and other consequences of climate change. Numerous studies have shown that Indigenous peoples across the globe are among the most vulnerable populations to the effects of climate change, and also that Indigenous activists have historically led the world in assessing and addressing the climate crisis. Today, we all have the pleasure and the privilege of conversing with three brilliant Indigenous climate activists who are going to share their experiences working within environmental justice movements, the trajectories that led them to become involved in these movements, and the activist strategies that they're employing to fight for both Indigenous sovereignty and climate justice. We hope that this event will serve as an opportunity to learn from these activist leaders and to share strategies for resistance against climate obstructionism and ongoing colonialism. As we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge that Brown University, the host of this event, is located on the homeland of the Narragansett and Mashpee Wampanoag peoples. We'd like to honor this land and the ongoing activism of the Narragansett and Wampanoag tribes, which you can learn more about by visiting the tribe's websites that we've linked in the chat. And please do actually click on those. We want to highlight the central role played by colonialism and racial capitalism in the climate crisis. And we hope that this event will help foster solidarity and spark positive change at the intersection of climate justice and Indigenous sovereignty. We encourage y'all to look up what Indigenous land you are occupying right now. And you'll see a link pop up right now in the chat. So you can use this function to find out exactly where you are, what you are occupying. And we'd really encourage you to share that information with us in the chat when you find it out, so we can all know where we're coming from. And I also just want to reiterate, we shared this in the chat, that after we conclude, the recording of this event will be shared on YouTube on the Watson Institute's channel. And if you don't feel comfortable with your voice or your video being captured, you may turn your video off and mute your audio for the duration of the event, and instead use the chat if you'd like to convey any thoughts. And lastly, of course, to reiterate, I want to thank our three event sponsors, which are here, our Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, also the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative here at Brown, and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. They've all offered extremely generous support, and the event wouldn't be possible, and particularly these excellent invitations that we've been able to make that have been accepted. They would not have been possible without all of the support. And Emily and I want to specifically thank Makana Kushi, Kate Goldman, and Patsy Lewis for their specific support and the work that they did to make this event possible today. So just before I turn it over to our panelists, I just want to let you know about our format. So we are going to allow our presenters to speak first. They'll have a chance to share their knowledge and experience with us. And after each one has shared, we'll ask everyone for questions and conversation. So we'll encourage you to share your video throughout the meeting, but also to only share your audio at the end of the meeting when we're doing the Q&A. And we really do genuinely believe in the power of community dialogue and the co-creation of knowledge. So please feel free to use the chat function throughout to express your thoughts. And so now I am going to introduce our first panelists. We'll first hear from Andrea, then we will move to Jen Sequoia, and then we'll finish with Ruth. And so I'll present each bio right before they speak. So first, Andrea Ixchiú Hernández is a Maya Quiche woman from Totonicapán, Guatemala. She's a defensora del territorio, a defender of indigenous territories. Her work is dedicated to developing communication strategies, narratives, and technologies for the defense of life and of territory. She's an abogada hacker, a producer, and an audiovisual filmmaker. And so I'll turn over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for everyone that has made this space possible. I'm really happy to be in this space and sharing some of the work and some of our experiences, and also some of the reflections above all, and to bring some questions around the conversation of the climate crisis. I had work also creating narrative initiatives for the defense of the territory also, because we deeply believe that changing communication, changing the narratives, we will be able to change the culture of destruction, the culture of imposed debt that is perpetuating and causing the crisis. And something that we have been reflecting collectively with other indigenous defenders is how a lot of the narratives also that are part of the conversation of the climate crisis are also reinforcing these systems of oppression and that are not actually criticizing the main causes and the main roots of the climate crisis. So I will share some of these reflections as we speak. And I wanted to share some of those. Yeah, thank you. So what do we mean by, bringing this inside of the climate crisis conversation? Well, I'm a Maya Quiche woman. I was born in indigenous communities where we have defended our ancestral forests since ever. And we are still now facing some of the bad political decisions that in the name of creating solutions for the climate crisis are imposing colonialism in our territories. So in times of climate crisis, the future is a territory also that must be defended. During these reflections and doing some of the work that we have been doing and reading a lot of the people that is creating, science and information around the climate crisis, we found out, for example, that the IPCC said that the climate change is widespread, it's rapid, it's intensifying, and without drastic and immediate action, global warming will extend the 2 degrees in Celsius in the upcoming decades. And also the narrative, we are understanding the narratives around this. The narrative of the IPCC report, it says that in the best case scenario, well, it's already bad. The sea level rise, extreme heats, floods, droughts, pandemics, famines. And also the IPCC report says we need to adapt the current crisis. If no immediate actions are taken, change will go beyond our capacity to adapt. They say that the current changes will last for hundreds of thousands of years, that we're living the delayed consequences of a century of burning fossil fuels combined with current emissions. And also they mentioned this, scientifically proved the human influence in the climate change. So when you come from this indigenous background with this indigenous knowledge, you ask yourself, where is the intersectionality? When the IPCC calls for the human influence, it's all humanity responsible in the same way? So we started to research and doing a lot of, questions around this narrative. And first of all, we know that the responsibility is the global north. The new critical studies that you can find shows how the rich countries are responsible for more than 92% of the global carbon dioxide surplus, while the global south pays the consequences of the climate crisis. Of the rich, on 1% of the population of the rich, the 1% of the rich double the emissions of the poorest 50% of the population. So this imposed concentration of wealth and power in few hands are driving forces of inequality in greenhouse emissions, but also in the effects of the crisis. It is projected that the majority of the deaths that are related to the climate change will happen in impoverished regions, regions that have been affected by other historical processes. We need, as we can, make some calculations and also using some other research, we know that we need 5 planet Earths if we continue the consumption pattern of the average North American people. And in contrast, indigenous communities, indigenous peoples have the smallest ecological footprint, which means our existence is within the planetary boundaries. Those few humans who influence climate change are also responsible for ecocide and genocide. And why we said that? We know that 90% of the pre-colonial population was exterminated. So 56 million people were exterminated in Abya in our continent, America, after the colonizers arrived, and 50 million lives from Africa were enslaved and sold like commodities to fulfill a market. So colonization is deeply linked to structural inequality that leads to climate crisis. So it's really important for us to read the climate crisis as a consequence, as a symptom of other diseases, as colonization. 92% of the animal population is exterminated between 1970 and 2021 during the rise of the neoliberal capitalism in the southern hemisphere of Abya Yala, during this same time, the animal population declined by 92%, one of the most alarming metrics in the history of our planet. So the growth has exceeded, for two, the planetary boundary. So raw material consumption has grown exponentially in the last 20 years, exceeding the safe boundary by double of consumption of what is needed to be alive. So virtually all the overshoot is from high income nations. And the imperative of growth, like economic growth, has been proved false. The economy cannot grow infinitely on a finite planet. So what it's really important for us also in the work of defending our land, defending our communities, defending our existences is shifting the narrative. The crisis is the cumulative result of a greed of a few, not just the direct impact of humans, as the IPCC report says. And those, greed of a few who have plundered the earth for more than 500 years. It's important to name that colonialism, capitalism, racism, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism are the root systems of inequality behind the current crisis. And the excess of carbon emissions and consumptions in the last century is related to the globalization of capitalism and the imperative of growth. Human influence in climate change is related to the ecocide and the genocide that maintain the privileges of a few. So the question also that we arise investigating and doing all this, research about the climate crisis and how it's related with us as indigenous communities that are defending the water, that are defending our land, that are defending our forests. We ask ourselves, well, what if living alternatives to the crisis already exist among us? Human diversity and biodiversity is linked. What we name today as indigenous is in fact what the colonial and capitalist world hasn't yet completely devoured. And 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world lives in indigenous territories. So comprising less than 6% of the world population and in stewardship of 23% of terrestrial territories, the indigenous peoples protect the 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world. So that must say something, right? There are 7,000 indigenous languages, and that's a list of 370 million indigenous peoples represented in the greater part of the world's cultural diversity. The indigenous biocultural heritage has demonstrated to preserve and diversify the network of life present in their territories. I come from a community, from a territory that has administrated its own forest, that has its own indigenous justice system, that we are fighting to keep our medicine, ancestral medicine, health systems, because it's really important to be aware that our living, that our health, that our path through this world doesn't need to mean the destruction of the world that is sustaining us. So it's really important to name is that the footprint of the indigenous communities has been the stepping more softly on the earth. The indigenous peoples have contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions and have a smallest ecological footprint on earth. The defense and governance of the territories have proved the most effective in preserving life in a really important and key biomes, important forests all over the world. So because also the proximity to the earth in our communities, we're suffering the worst impacts, not only of climate change, but also from the mitigation measures that have been taken by the global community. There has been imposition, to hydroelectrical dams that are sold that as green energies or, sustainable energies, but are causing colonization of rivers, that are creating displacement of other indigenous communities, that are causing criminalization of indigenous authorities. So it's really important to be aware that in these big models of generating big generators of energy for a few, a lot of indigenous communities that are preserving those biomes are being, exterminated. So what do we mean with living alternatives to climate crisis? We're saying that the alternatives doesn't need to be, traveling to Mars in an expensive spaceship built by rich people, where only the most wealthy people will be able to afford their trip to Mars. So when they are finishing to exploit this project, this planet, they will travel to new to new planets to colonize them. So what we're saying is that the indigenous people's knowledge is the biggest and the most diverse repository of alternatives to the climate change in the world. That our territories are the remaining biodiversity that will be key for the future of the planet. We know that more than 370,000 million people, approximately the size of the US, are already running economical models based on the principles of reciprocity with the earth. Indigenous is the name given to the largest human nature diversity in the world. Most of these cultures precede the monoculture of the West, and indigenous peoples are being exterminated by the ongoing ecocide and genocide that started 500 years ago. And this must stop now. So it's really important to be named and part of the necessity of shifting some of the narratives about the climate crisis. Indigenous peoples who defend their territories are living alternatives to the climate crisis. But why isn't this yet a common sense in the climate narrative? So we have been running a lot of data analysis, reading the climate change reports, and we're following some important conversations around the communities in North America, Latin America, and the global North, climate deniers. We have examined the narratives. We're trying to understand how they work, how the people is communicating. And we know that in the global South, there is clear indigenous organization against specific struggles, while the rich communities, the young climate activists, are linking climate change to systems of oppression. So it's really important for us to understand those narratives, to read them, and to be aware that the importance of shifting those narratives. And we know that the living alternatives is a frame that connects diverse communities and solidify the notion that solutions for the climate crisis are already present. It's important to see this emergency as a consequence. It's important to tell the story of the crisis as a symptom, not as a disease. Make intersectional storytelling of the climate crisis and the structural inequalities, and also naming the responsibility proportional to the privileges. It's urgent to name this machine of extermination because it's really necessary to understand what's going on right now, naming the genocide past, but also the present. It's important to name the ecocide past and also the present, so we can understand all the patterns, the systems. And it's really necessary to talk about climate justice as a way to stop the extermination and abolish structural inequalities. We cannot understand climate justice in our communities without, stopping the mind from coming into our territories, to stopping a mega project to introduce without our consent in our territories and in our lands. The living alternatives to the climate crisis are there, and it's really important to name the diversity of indigenous land defenders that tell their crisis from their own perspectives. It's really important because sometimes we have seen a lot of the media, a lot of the documentaries trying, to fit the scientific discourse in the way that the people is organizing in their territories. And it needs to be in other way. It's really important to respect the perspectives of the indigenous communities and the way they are facing that in their own lives and they're facing it in their own bodies. It's really urgent to amplify indigenous voices and epistemologies. Just don't be intermediaries. It's really urgent, to let the people talk and do it from themselves. It's important to visibilize actions in defense of life and territories as living alternatives to the climate crisis. And what are the kind of living alternatives that we have followed? There's important struggles happening right now. For example, in Brazil, the communities have been mobilized for their lives, for the territories. They're racing for the Mother Earth, and they have teach us that the struggle for Mother Earth is the mother of all struggles. So it's really important, to pay attention to those voices. There are networks of indigenous land defenders that are trying, to bring message inside of big forums of the COP26. And it's really hard for indigenous land defenders, participate in certain spaces. We're only invited to these big climate conferences as observers and not to make decisions even in our own territories. We have seen the coverage of the climate crisis done by indigenous perspective, by indigenous independent media documentaries and journalists that are coming from Brazil, from Mexico, from Guatemala. And we know that there are important efforts in the US also of doing this collective coverage. And then other spaces done by Indigenous women land defenders that are trying to put their voices and that are calling us to be part of the cure of the earth in times of climate crisis. So I know that we have like really short time, so I will leave that there. And I would just invite really all of you, especially that you're working from academia and you're working from these spaces, you know, when we know that in the times of imposed debt, it's really urgent to organize. In times of climate crisis, we must defend the future, because the voices of the people who for thousands of years have defended life on Earth have really important message of hope to share. The alternatives to the crisis are here, they exist, they're alive. And as we Indigenous peoples protect and preserve the linguistic, cultural, and spiritual diversity of the world, and the 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet, in our territories, in our practices of respect and reciprocity with Earth, we remind the beating pulse of the futures, but they are exterminating us. So it's really important to say that being part of this cure of the earth is called the healing of the earth as a defense of life and territory. Call it community management of water and energy, territorial autonomies, Indigenous governments, rescue of the linguistic diversity, the defense of our identities, the search for memory and justice, migration without borders, you know, returning to cyclical times, honor the knowledge of the grandmothers and the grandfathers, defend the futures for the generations to come, and practice other forms of spirituality to organize our neighborhood, our community festivals, and re-existing. So it's really important, because after these pandemic times, we realized that we didn't want to return to normality, but return with love to the earth. So it's really important to share that message for me with you, and also to call you to join the Indigenous resistance, to amplify our voices, to highlight the work of the defense of the land and the territory, and especially to respect the leading voices of Indigenous women leaders, young climate activists that are already there. We are going to listen also some other two right now. And to say that also it's really important to keep strengthened our networks of our organization between Latin America and between, you know, North America. It's really important to cross those colonial borders, as the rivers, as the wind does every day and every time, since we know and have memory as communities. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I want to remind y'all that you can share any questions or comments that you might have in the chat as we go along. And then at the end of all of our presentations, we'll have some time for a conversation. And so we'll move right along to our next presenter. And Jansique Medina Tayak is a Piscataway Indian and Colombian community organizer, filmmaker, and climate activist from Tacoma Park, Maryland. She's currently a student at Pitzer College, pursuing a degree in media studies and environmental analysis. Jansique has organized climate strikes and protests with 0 Hour, a youth-led climate organization. She's also a filmmaker and has made films documenting climate justice issues such as the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis and water contamination in the DC area. And I'll pass it to you, Jansique.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. It really is an honor to be holding this space with Andrea and Ruth as well. I feel really fortunate to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Cool.
Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry about that, guys. So hello, my name is Jansique. I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about my experience as a youth environmental justice activist, as an Indigenous and Latina woman living here on our planet. So we can go ahead and get to the next slide. So I am a 20-year-old DC-based activist. I am Piscataway, and I'm also Colombian. I consider myself a filmmaker and a community organizer, and I'm currently attending Pitzer College in Claremont, California. So It is my first year here, and I am still undecided about what I want to do, but I think media studies and environmental analysis is what I'm going to go with. Luckily, I have quite a bit of time. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So just to give you a little bit of background about where I come from, I'm Piscataway. So we are the Indigenous people of Maryland. And Piscataway means where the rivers blend. So the entire area that is the Chesapeake Bay, extending down to the Potomac River and flowing into all the little creeks and streams that sustain the DC area is Piscataway land, and it's where my people originate from. I'm actually named after the Potomac River. So my name, Jancy Quay, means beautiful river woman. And I've always been raised to understand the connection between us and our Mother Earth, and the interconnectedness of water and land and animals and us as humans. And through ceremony and community, I've really come to understand that as humans, we are one very small part of a huge picture, and that our role is to coexist within rather than to dominate the world that we are a part of. And this value has really been fundamental in the way that I approach my work as an activist and community organizer. And in these pictures here, you can see in the bottom is a picture of our burial grounds, Piscataway National Park, so Southern Maryland, where we have our ancestral lands. This is where our chief's town was, and we hold a lot of ceremony here. And at the top, we see Nanjemoy, Maryland, and we have some land there as well that is located on a creek. We can go to the next slide. So to talk a little bit about where everything began for me, I've always been surrounded by a beautiful and intergenerational community of BIPOC organizers and leaders, particularly with women in power and holding these spaces. And as I grew older, I really felt that my purpose as a person living on this earth was to protect it. And it wasn't really just a passion, but more so I felt like my responsibility as a human being living on this planet. In April 2017, I began volunteering with the People's Climate Movement, where my brother was working at the time. And I just began really small, passing out flyers and operating phone lines, getting my friends involved and calling schools and stuff like that. And the day before the big march happened, I found out that there was going to be an Indigenous peoples rally in front of Trump Tower in DC. And they actually asked me if I wanted to speak. And I remember sort of being taken aback because I had no idea really that a young person like me could make such an impact. And I didn't realize that I sort of had that power as a young person, because we're often taught as young people that we are voiceless in this society. But you know, through the Standing Rock movement, through my family, I started hearing about and meeting young water protectors, like Jacelyn Charger and Tokata Iron Eyes, Alethea Phillips. And that really fostered a sense of empowerment within me that I too could make my voice be heard. So I went up to the mic that night and I talked about my own experience as an Indigenous person. And for the first time, I really felt like my voice mattered. And that's sort of where everything started. So we can go to the next slide. So I really look at my organizing and activism on sort of 3 levels. There's outside of our community. So this is the stuff that like we usually see on the news and that's getting kind of the most attention because that's its purpose, which is like mass mobilization, media coverage, bringing awareness to issues about issues that are affecting our community and bringing that outside of the community and informing people. And then second is within our communities. So how can we build those safe spaces for people within our community? How can we build trust? How can we hold events that are just for us and also healing together? And then lastly, it's the work with yourself. And I argue that this is really one of the hardest parts of organizing and something that really gets overlooked and something that I've definitely struggled with the most. And that's just loving ourselves and keeping track of our physical and mental well-being, and also recognizing when we're extremely tired and burnt out and when we need to take that time for ourselves. So I'll be going through these three sort of levels of organizing throughout my presentation today, so we can move on. So one of the ways that we can reach outside of our community, and an amazing tactic, is through filmmaking. So in such a fast-paced world that we're in right now, where social media and quick bits of information are becoming so influential and more influential every day, filmmaking is really an incredible tool to reach large audiences and also bring to light the issues that our communities are facing. So I was really lucky enough to attend a high school where they had a media program, and I decided that I would bring attention to the issues that were impacting my community through film in a way that was accessible to everybody. So on free platforms like YouTube, or for example, C-SPAN. When I was in 10th grade, I ended up making a film about the missing and murdered Indigenous crisis. So this was a year after my first talk. And we really wanted to highlight the voices of Indigenous women and their experiences living on reservations, and also seeing their sisters being, disappearing and being murdered and violated as a cause caused by non-Indigenous men coming onto the reservations. And this is often linked to things like coal mining and oil and pipelines, which we know many of our Indigenous communities are actively fighting right now. I also was able to use film to highlight some of the issues that were going on specifically in DC. So another film that I made was about climate injustice in DC and water contamination. And with that, we were able to work with an organization called Black Millennials for Flint. And it was a group of young Black women who were working to bring awareness to the water contamination and lead contamination that was happening in DC. So we can go to the next slide. Another really useful tactic in bringing awareness is through climate strikes and protests and civil disobedience, because it not only brings attention to these issues that we're facing through, media coverage and news outlets, but also it really creates a sense of unity among large groups of people, and people are really able to come together, people who don't know each other, people from different backgrounds, and they can really hold that space together and be next to each other, sort of hand in hand and in solidarity, being able to advocate for the issues that they care about. So one example is climate strikes. We saw a huge boom in climate strikes happening in especially like 2019. And so we had one in DC where we made sure to feature Indigenous people, Black people, BIPOC people, musicians, poets, poetry, just all kinds of things, so that people had that space to bring attention to the issues that they cared about on a large scale. Another example of a way you could do this is through civil disobedience. So for example, with Fire Drill Fridays was sort of like a climate strike organized by Jane Fonda, actually, in which every week on Friday, they would do an act of civil disobedience and actually get arrested at the Capitol. So that brought a lot of attention to the issues that we were facing, because not only was it a famous person talking about it, but also getting arrested is kind of a big deal. So yeah, those are a few other ways to sort of address those issues on a larger scale. We can go to the next slide. So the next sort of level of organizing that I was talking about is building trust and safe spaces within our communities. So for example, students, oftentimes we find ourselves in places that are predominantly white, in schools and colleges and workplaces. And it's really essential for us to be able to create that safe space where we can call our own, because that's really where our sort of radical healing and change and planning happens. So for example, here at Pitzer, we've started a Native Indigenous Student Union, where students have their own space to come together and talk about their experiences as young people and as students in this PWI. And also there are student-led, organizations, for example, called This Is Zero Hour, is a youth of color led organization that really focuses on providing that space for young people of color to organize, and also then take that and educate people outside of our circles on stuff like the Green New Deal and systems of oppression that are perpetuating the climate crisis. So we can go to the next one. And then another way to build community would be through more like intimate ceremony and circles and workshops, particularly ones that are BIPOC and women led. So we have a project that's going on right now called Nikamako, and it's a land rematriation project based in our Piscataway homelands. So it's really under the leadership of Indigenous matriarchs, and its purpose is to help restore and promote the traditional ecological knowledge and spiritual ways of life that we've really kind of lost due to colonization and capitalism. And we, were able to occupy this space and take back our land and hold circles that are healing and informative for women of color and BIPOC women, because we usually, again, we don't have those sort of spaces, and we often find ourselves very isolated. So being able to sort of hold that space where women of color can come together. For example, we had like a deerskin bag workshop, or we work together on planting a garden, those sort of things where we can sort of reconnect with our spirituality and our Indigenous knowledge that's really been lost is super important. And because these, again, are the spaces where our ideas and our radical solutions really come out, where we can plan together. We can go to the next one. So the last sort of level of organizing that I like to look at is doing the work on yourself and that sort of self-love. As young people, we, especially with the pandemic, have faced so many trials and tribulations between, the elections. I remember being in 9th grade when Trump was being elected, and then, facing those 4 years and then only to be hit by COVID. A lot of young people have experienced really great loss. Everybody has experienced a lot of great loss, and also a loss of momentum with the climate movement, as people continue to face so much depression and anxiety and trauma and grief. And I think it's really easy to feel isolated and also feel like you're not really doing enough because you're so burnt out. I've definitely had this feeling where I feel guilty almost for not doing the same kind of work that I used to do, especially during the pandemic. And I think it really took the pandemic to happen for me to understand that taking care of myself was also essential in being an activist and being an organizer and being here for my community. Because unless we take care of ourselves, we can't take care of other people. And so even though I think COVID brought a lot of really upsetting things, it also forced me to take the time to love myself and to really identify what was important to me and what I needed to do to maintain my mental and physical well-being. So yeah, here are just some pictures throughout the pandemic, my first time wearing a mask, or the Black Lives Matter protests, or even graduating through the TV. All of these things were shocking. And I think being able to take that time for myself was really essential, because now I'm here and I'm ready to do the work again. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a quote from Audre Lorde, and it says, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation." And that is an act of political warfare. And I think reading this really made me understand that self-care in itself is radical, and that it's just as important as building community and also reaching outside of community. Because like I said, taking care of ourselves is essential in order to work towards our goals and progress. And I think, especially during this time with the pandemic, it is really essential for us to take care of ourselves. So yeah, that is all I have for you guys, but thank you so much for having me. And I hope this sort of helped people think about the movement in a different way on these sort of levels.
Thank you so much, Jen Sikwe. That was really lovely. I really appreciated how much you've integrated those different levels of activist action. So thank you, thank you. Again, reminder that you can share your questions or comments in the chat as we go, and we will follow with our final presenter. And so Ruth Shivaya Kitsen is a Dena'ina, Athabaskan, and Ashkenazi Russian Jewish woman raised in Anchorage, Alaska. Ruth is the Climate Justice Director for Native Movement, a matriarchal grassroots Indigenous organization that fights for the rights of Indigenous peoples, our lands and waters, and justice for our ancestors and descendants. She is a member of the Curyung Tribe of Dillingham and Bristol Bay, though her family is from the Kihik village from Lake Clark region. She graduated from Brown University, built on occupied Wampanoag and Narragansett lands, and received a BA in Critical Development Studies with a focus on Indigenous resistance and liberation. She's worked for years toward climate justice and a regenerative economy for all on her lands and beyond, including time as one of the youngest Capitol Hill interns to date in the office of former Senator Mark Begich. Her work also includes international advocacy, including attending the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UN Youth Climate Summit, COP25 in Madrid, Spain, and the Continental Gathering of Indigenous Women of the Americas. Also, the Youth for Climate pre-COP26 event of 2021 in Milan, Italy, and COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. She's a founding member of the Fireweed Collective, a statewide alliance of young Alaskans dedicated to building community, developing leaders, and activating our generation for a just and sustainable Alaska. She's a daughter, a granddaughter, an auntie, a language learner, a traditional bead worker, and a subsistence fisherwoman. And take it away, Ruth.
Yachlidu everyone, Shivaya Ixchiú Dena'ina Ruth Miller Gushtanish Ixchiú Shidasnak Heather Kendall Miller Shumpta Lloyd Miller Stukta Chakayang Asmanish Ite the Hayakak Shuguya Studa Shidka Kwan Shakaya Kilanda Cheknekali Kidiki Yatalhanu Bakut Yachli at Sete. My English name is Ruth. I'm named after both of my grandmothers. My Dena'ina name is Shivaya Kitsen, and that name was gifted to me by my first language teacher, Dena'ina Slauson, and it means whirlwind woman. I am also going to be sharing a couple of different things, but it will be bouncing around a little bit. But first, I'd like to presence that today I am not calling in from my homelands. I am on the traditional homelands of the Kuksadi tribe of Tlingit here in Chitkakwan in Sitka, Alaska, where we just finished a long week of strategic planning and ceremony and some really, really beautiful gatherings, a little bit of which I'd like to share with you all. But first, I'd also like to explain that in my introduction, I present my genealogy and my ancestors that I call into the room, as well as acknowledge my parents and my grandmothers that have come before me. I am a Dena'ina and Ashkenazi Jewish woman, though I was born in Techiakak in Anchorage. My family is from Old Kijik village, which was abandoned in the early 1900s because of the epidemics that wiped out about 80% of our Alaska Native population. My family then went downriver to Ikuk village and then to Dillingham, and I was raised in the city. And so I am so overwhelmed with gratitude for the two women who have spoken before me, Andrea and Jen Sikwe, and I am just excited to kind of get into the conversation point. But before I share any about my work, it is traditional for us to lead with our elders and words from our elders. And so I have permission to share this video from an author who I just said goodbye to yesterday. She was here with us for a week. Her name is Nutak, and she is from Utqiagvik, and has these words to share with you. Let me see if it plays. Please tell me if you can hear her.
We can't hear.
Oh, okay.
Did you click the share sound box at the bottom of when you do the share screen?
Now I did. Thank you.
Okay.
Wanga nudak utqarving meo. Angop kanat koyak suli Simmons koyak. My name is Doreen Simmons. I'm from the Angopkana and the Simmons family. And my favorite ice cream is akutok, Eskimo ice cream. 100 years ago, our people were completely nomadic community. All the families were nomadic. We followed the birds, the fish, the whales. When they were in season, we were there. And so they were like our leaders. They were our bosses. And we had to keep the land clean for them. We could not have a messy, a trashy, dirty place for them to come to, or they wouldn't want to come at all. And we loved to eat what they gave us. We had much gratitude for them when they came. And we need to keep that up. This is our land. And this is what we call Tariok, where we get our whale and our fish.
Okay, Chinen Khali to Kayanakpak to Nutak for sharing those words with us. I love that little clip. A year ago, she's very, very dear to me. She's one of my close aunties, and a year ago or so, I asked her to film a little clip of herself describing what climate justice means to her. She's part of our advisory board as well, and that was what she shared with me, and that's what I now share with all of you. So in our work in confronting the climate crisis here in Alaska, we take a multifaceted approach, which we're going to get into. But our organization, Native Movement, as was shared before, is an Indigenous matriarchal, really wonderful family that has been really redefining how nonprofits can be active in an Indigenous context. We have, I'd say, 98% Indigenous staff. Again, we just gathered here in Chitkakwan for a week together. And I initiated and now lead our climate justice department. But that has been building on almost a decade of my personal advocacy in climate justice. So I began this journey, and again, I'm just picking up on so many resonating points from what we've already heard today, but I began this journey not out of interest or because of a hobby or because I was interested in the environment, but because as an Indigenous woman, we have an ancestral imperative to love our lands and to protect them. When you love something, of course you defend it. And so when I was 14 or 15, I began working out in my home region in Bristol Bay, advocating against the Pebble Mine, which would have sacrificed the last great salmon fishery in the world for the sake of one of the largest open pit mines for copper and gold called the Pebble Mine. We've been fighting for the protection of our watershed for over 20 years, and we are finally close to permanent protections, but that was certainly a good introduction for me as a young teenager to stand out in a harbor talking to fishermen and Native community folks, trying to convince them to give testimony for, in the US, these EPA hearings that will determine the way our lands are managed. It was working within the framework of an extractive system that was never meant to protect our lands, but only meant to regulate usage of land for the US empire. And yet we we're able to collect hundreds and hundreds of testimonials from community members, dictating how valuable our lands were to us, how we share DNA with the Xika, the salmon of this region, and how we as people rely on our natural environment for our cultural continuity. But also, as Andrea expressed quite well, we have no other choice but to begin protecting our lands and waters, and to begin stopping and divesting from the extractive machine that has gotten us to the crisis we are in today. So in Alaska, we are experiencing the climate crisis at 2 to 4 times the rate as the rest of the world. Our Arctic sea ice is melting in ways that it never has before, and we are seeing less and less sea ice form every winter. What that means as far as planetary consequences go is that not only are we going to see a massive rise in sea levels from the melting of Arctic ice, but again, the ice will no longer be forming to reflect sunlight. So it will exponentially increase the warming and the acidification of our ocean waters. We are also experiencing the thawing of our permafrost, the foundation upon which most of our communities rely on. The solid ground that is frozen not only will continue to thaw and destabilize all infrastructure in our rural villages, but it will also begin to decompose. What was once in a freezer will now begin to thaw, and all the organic materials that are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old will begin to release particularly methane and other CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. So we are in a ticking time bomb here in the Arctic, where what happens here will have exponential impacts on the rate of acceleration of the climate crisis over the rest of the world. But we also know that our food security, our food systems, our cultures will suffer even sooner than that. Already last summer, when I went out fishing for my family as our main subsistence food provider, I witnessed our Xika, our salmon, dying in our streams from heat stroke, because under cloudless skies, they were suffering heat that they've never before felt. We had what we call ghost fish washing up on our shores. And of course, these are only, impacts that are going to accelerate. We also face the very acute impacts of the causes of the climate crisis. As Andrea also articulated, we know that the climate crisis was caused by colonization, not only through massive ecocide and the destruction of all of our carbon sinks that cleanse our earth and cleanse our air, but also because of the capitalist-driven extraction that insists on more and more taking from our lands without any form of reciprocity or respect that allowed our indigenous communities to thrive for 30,000 years before capitalism. So when we talk about colonization, it is not just a matter of lands being taken out of indigenous management, which was the first violation. But as we also continue to experience genocide against our peoples and pollution of our lands, we are still facing the ongoing process of colonization. The acute impacts of the climate crisis that we see in our homelands is, as Sequoia was mentioning, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and two-spirit relatives. And I'll touch back on this in a little bit, but as we see a rise in the violation of our homelands and mining projects and fracking, we also see that the man camps around such projects are also violating Indigenous women at 2 to 4 times the rate of any other demographic in the United States or in Canada. Indigenous women are on the front lines of this kind of gendered violence that originates from these projects of extraction, as they also pollute toxins into our food systems, causing respiratory illnesses and birth defects and other forms of cancer in the bodies of the villagers who live in proximity to them. So the violence against Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada is very, very real. And of course, we see vast amounts of assassinations in other places, particularly in Latin America and South America. So there is no way to cloud the fact that Indigenous peoples, our existence, is a direct threat to the capitalist colonial machine that is perpetuating the climate crisis, because we are being, hunted and genocided still today. So when we consider what it means to resist the climate crisis as Indigenous peoples, it is not only a matter of challenging systems of inequality and protecting our people from the violence we are facing. It is also because we have vast cultural wealth. We have ancestral knowledge, encyclopedic data from 30,000 years or more of living with these lands. So we know better than anyone else how to take care of them. In my Dena'ina territory, our entire language was constructed about this place and no place else. And our Indigenous sciences and life ways must be validated as rich pathways for rejuvenation and for recovery from the climate crisis, because it is also Indigenous communities who are not only slowing the crisis, but also have the answers. I always love to share this statistic from Indigenous environmental networks, Indigenous resistance to, about Indigenous resistance against carbon, which I can drop the link in the chat. But in this report, they demonstrated the tangible impacts that Indigenous campaigns of resistance have had against the fight against fossil fuel expansion across what is currently called Canada and the US. They quantified the metric tons of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions that have either been stopped or delayed in the past decade due to Indigenous land defenders. And adding up to the total, Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions. So that means our campaigns against Line 3, our campaigns against the Dakota Access Pipeline, our campaigns to protect the Amazon, our campaigns to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, they work. They stop the extraction of fossil fuels and the subsequent release of greenhouse gas emissions. It shows that our only salvation will not come from carbon mitigation and other false solutions that just hope to perpetuate the same extractive system. It means that we really must end all fossil fuel extraction and fundamentally reassess the ways that our modern nation states are insisting we live. We need to turn towards reliance on our Indigenous communities' leadership and their life ways to renegotiate how we move in society together, how we view economy, and how we treat our lands and waterways. And so, we've talked a bit about climate change in the Arctic. It's always a bit inexpressible to me because our homelands are so distinct and unique and diverse. Alaska, what is now called Alaska, is nearly the size of Europe. If you cut it in half, both halves would still be bigger than Texas. We have over 250 sovereign tribal nations, and we have over 27 Indigenous languages that are still spoken today. And we have immense geographical diversity, from Arctic tundra to boreal forests to rainforests, where I'm now calling in from. And this also means that we have diverse landscapes with which to grow, to adapt, and to also, initiate new and innovative solutions. And so in my work and in our work in addressing the climate crisis, we use both inside strategy, like a bit of what we talked about, calling the EPA to give testimony and function within policymaking spheres, including international climate spaces like the COP, as well as national campaigns like the Green New Deal. And then we also address our outside strategies, which do not bow to the systems of extraction that we are forced to work within, but instead rely on building capacity within our Indigenous communities, redefining what economy and regenerative economy can mean, as well as uplifting ceremony and art as climate solutions. So as I'm calling in now on Monday, last Monday I arrived here in Chitkakwan for 5 and 10 year strategic planning with my organization, which included so much song and prayer, which included plant and medicine walks, but also included the great Tlingit Kuich, a potlatch ceremony to celebrate the subsistence foods that we love here in this region, and the arrival of the herring eggs. So I'd like to share a bit about that at the end, because our dedication to ceremony is also a climate solution, and re-envisioning and reintegrating the values frameworks that create our ceremonies, such as respect and love and dedication and reciprocity, also must be made relevant to our economies and our industries, our work. And so I wanted to take us through a couple different resources that we have made over the past few years to kind of try to illustrate some of the approaches that we've taken. And the first one, I'd like to kind of engage the Living Alternatives to Climate Change framework that Andrea presented and share our Culture-Ethne framework, which obviously is very similar. So let me see. Okay. So I mentioned that one of the techniques that we use is engaging in policy from an Indigenous perspective, indigenizing that policy. I see my work as being a professional translator, a professional code switcher, right? I'm an Indigenous woman that was raised in a traditional way, close to our lands, and I've also received, higher education in a Western sense. I attended Brown University for my BA, and so I know that I am uniquely positioned to bridge these gaps, and also, bridge the gaps between climate science and climate policy, as well as our Indigenous sciences and our Indigenous lifeways and governance systems. So one initiative that we began engaging with over the past year was the National Green New Deal. I was the Alaska State lead for the Green New Deal network, and one of the very first iterations from this network was the Thrive Agenda, which was an economic recovery plan. It was it was the most radical, most pushiest, everything that we need version of what the Green New Deal might have hoped to be if it were to actually fix our problems. Unfortunately, we all know that it got quite pared and slimmed down. But the initial Thrive Agenda, Transform, Heal, and Renew by Investing in a Vibrant Economy, was a 10-year, $10 trillion investment plan that turned attention towards climate, care, jobs, and justice. It had 8 different planks that established the different focuses of the Thrive Agenda. But what I wanted to show from the zine that we created here was the way that we indigenized it and made it relevant to our communities, to make it accessible, to make it relevant. You'll see a lot of our Indigenous languages represented here. And then to uplift the ways that our communities are already leading this. We didn't need to wait for national policy to dictate how we should recover from the climate crisis. We wanted to elevate the local stories that are already achieving these regenerative practices. And so you'll see the 8 branches of the Thrive Agenda here, but then in each one we uplifted these examples of what creating sustainable local food systems might like. The unions that are forming around solar installation companies here in Alaska, and other such examples. And so what was particularly important for us out of this that I wanted to articulate is that, this engagement in policy by Indigenous communities was crucial, because then we began to edit and give feedback and give, make sure that there was deep resonance with these policies. And the national coordinators deeply valued the input that we repeatedly gave. And adapted their national policy to ensure that it represented Alaska well, to ensure that our Indigenous peoples could see ourselves in this policy. Of course, that doesn't mean that's what actually got passed in Congress, but it was a really important exercise in ensuring that there was deep Indigenous integration into some of these policies that are meant to save us from the climate crisis. And so this created a pathway of engagement for our Indigenous communities to access, otherwise extremely exclusive decision-making platforms. We discussed free, prior, and informed consent. We discussed what a regenerative economy might look for Alaska, which is the current, present oil colony of the US. And so I'd be happy to link this if anyone would like to take a closer look at it. But a few months after that, we deepened this work. We began our first Alaska Native Filmmakers Intensive, which mentored about 12 Alaska Native emerging filmmakers, paired them with mentors and allowed them to access the resources of the university here in Alaska. They created short films all around climate justice and what climate justice means to them and what their experience of climate change was like in their home communities. Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to share this resource really quickly here so that you can take a look at it, and then I will drop it in the chat as well. And so the emphasis of this workbook that I created was, again, to bridge, traditional Western climate science with our Indigenous stories of climate science and what that means to us. Here we go. And so we discussed, and created opportunities for deep reflection around what climate justice means to us. But it's not just, what is climate change and what are greenhouse gas emissions? It's what was our relationship with the land before colonization? What will our relationship with the land be like? How do we return to balance so that we are integrating our Indigenous knowledges and our perspectives into our revolution? And ensuring that we have narrative sovereignty and the ability to tell our own stories so that we are not only the perpetual victims of the climate crisis constantly on the front lines, but we are also on the forefront of the resistance to climate change, and that we are also the dreamers and the visionaries that will be able to re-envision our economies. And so this framework that I've just described, what we call it is Kotreshne, which in the language of the Lower Tanana Dene and the Benti Kanaga language means remembering forward. We went to our elders and we said, how do we describe all this? How do we describe the revolution that it will take in our social values, in our economy, in the way that we see labor, in our governance structures? How do we move all that to a regenerative framework? What would we call that? And they said, oh, well, we already know what that looks like. We remember it. And so the phrase Kotreshne came to them, which means remembering forward. In my language, we call it Nuchelnik. It is remembered within us. And this is the framework that we use to engage, other climate and environmental organizations, often white-led organizations who need to do their decolonization work. It's what we use to engage unions, labor unions, and other industries that are looking to, revolutionize the way that they engage with sustainability, and the ways that they are exploring, clean energy and renewable energy. We want to make sure that that is safe for our Indigenous communities and does not perpetuate harm against our Indigenous lands. All of the minerals that that will be necessary for solar panels will have to be mined, and likely will be mined from Indigenous land. So how do we ensure that the practices that are leading us to regeneration are safe for our Indigenous peoples as well and uplift their leadership? And so I know that I'm at time. I just wanted to share a couple quick pictures from my time at Brown, if that's okay, because I thought that would be sweet. I actually hadn't looked at these in a while. But revolution always starts in community. And so what I noticed when I was pulling some of these pictures together is the Indigenous joy in these photos. We came together so lonely and so distanced at Brown University, and put together so many events each year to make our presence known, to make sure that we could see one another, that we could gather. I'm going to skip past the pictures that are just of me, is me holding a bag of potatoes. And we laughed together. We shared ceremony together. We came together to ensure that we could see one another in these highly colonized spaces. And then to make sure that we, could hear our laughter resounding in these halls. We worked very closely with our Mashpee Wampanoag relatives in the area. We shared so much food and shared so many stories during our years there. But this was really on the labor of the students that you see pictured here, that we were able to win in renaming of Indigenous Peoples Day, that we were able to win the creation of our Native American Studies initiative and such. So I just wanted to share some of those photos, and very, very lastly, just echo what Jensikwe shared at the end about self-care. That is the core of all this work, is healing work, care work. And if we're not being kind to ourselves, particularly as young Indigenous women, then nothing that comes from our labor will be founded on the values we know are necessary to carry us forward. So I'll stop talking there. Thank you for
Thank you so much to Ruth and to all three of our presenters. I am filled with a lot of gratitude for the enormous generosity you've all had to share both things that are so personal to you all, but also things that help us to think about the personal as systemic, and to use that as a pathway toward engaging change on really impactful scales. I'm also really grateful for what y'all shared about the real doing of the work, I think we've gotten to hear so much about the problem, but you've all helped us to like really start, for me anyway, think generatively about actual doing of solution work. So, thank you so much. And I'm going to keep my comments really brief since we are getting kind of close to the end of our time. And Emily and I really wanted to invite everybody to, click on your cameras for a moment, share, a question or a comment in the chat for our speakers. Also, if our speakers have questions for each other, now's a great time. And just for us to at least be able to see each other for a minute and think a little bit more towards the doing of climate change solutions. So yeah, what would we like to share?
I have a question, if possible.
Please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Josue, also my Kitsen from Guatemala. And I wanted to thank all of you all for your presentations. And my question is more relating to how do you talk to people like who fundamentally and maybe cosmologically view climate change so much differently than Indigenous peoples do, and Indigenous activists and Indigenous communities do. And I'm in particular with relation to like places of power, places such as Brown University, right, where 70% of the students here come from the top 1%, right, who come from families who at times may represent our oppressors. And so kind of just bridging like that gaps between of like the people who are doing the groundwork, the Indigenous communities who are doing the groundwork, and also trying to gain mostly the material support and attention to like the issues that Indigenous communities are facing throughout the world.
Would one of our panelists like to jump in?
Yeah, I can start. Thank you, Josue, for your question. Well, say that open up a dialogue, it's so always necessary. And inviting someone to a dialogue with you implicates your attention and also reciprocity. So sometimes the problem is that we as Indigenous communicators, land defenders, campaign organizers are quite open to dialogue, but sometimes people just do not engage with it. Sometimes they don't want to question their own privileges, and that's hard. So because it's not the possibility to open up a conversation. And when there's people that I actually have that, that attitude, that disposition, that will, you emerge into, having long chats or also different ways of talking if you are also in that disposition. And sometimes it's really hard. In a country like Guatemala, all the times the Indigenous communities are called to, we call them in Spanish, mesa de diálogo. Now we like this round tables to speak with the people in government. But the thing is that we're not opening dialogues from horizontal conditions. We're always in disadvantage and not like in a equal situation. So the problem is that, for example, for us as Indigenous communities to open up a dialogue and ask, for others' understandings and ways of existing to be respected doesn't have the same amplification, for example, that a tweet that is done by John Kerry or, because there's other platforms that amplifies those privileged voices. They have all the mainstream media, they have all the newspapers, they have all the platforms they want to amplify their voices. In our cases, we all the time are trying to hack those platforms so our narratives also can be present. And sometimes we create our own platforms to spread our own words. So it's always a challenge, and it also will depend on, sometimes the possibility of having that aperture from different actors to have a conversation. Recently in the COP26, we faced these heavy situations, when the Indigenous climate leaders were invited to be observers, and basically you were put outside of these big rooms of the COP, watching a screen, watching a Zoom call in the same building where the people in power was inside actually taking decisions. So those are the dialogues that are imposed by power. So I think it's like a really hard scenario sometimes. And I all the time admire the will, the courage, the patience of a lot of the indigenous leaders that actually they had to deal with all that bureaucracy, and also to respect that work, because it's not easy to open up those dialogues. And for us, it's all the time a lot of things of, connecting the data and crossing our investigations and our researches, so we can speak in the same languages. Because for us, we know that the river is important, that it's sacred because it gave us life. But we were born thinking, feeling, living, existing in that way. Sometimes talking that to a data scientist is not the same. Talking to a politician is not. So it requires to strategize, to create codes in a way that we can understand each other. And indigenous communities had learned the languages of the colonizers since ever. So it's a part of the process of learning, is a part of the strategizing, and it's the part of using the tools that we have so we can create more dialogues. And sometimes when the dialogues are not possible, we keep resisting and we keep existing because there's no other way.
Yeah, that is so well said. Gracias, Andrea. I would also just add, go find the people who are willing to do their homework. It is so over time. It is so overdue. Like an example that comes to mind in our community is the creation of the Alaska Climate Alliance, which we built about 2 years ago, which was supposed to be a resource and information sharing network for environmental and indigenous climate organizations across Alaska, right? So we built this alliance, maybe 80 different organizations, but we knew that we were not aligned in our values frameworks, because oftentimes big green groups can be really racist and can really work against the interests of indigenous communities if they are not willing to deeply respect indigenous sovereignty and land back. So we knew that we were not aligned, but we knew that we needed a table to at least have conversation at, to sit at. And so as we began working through this alliance, we didn't sacrifice our values. Instead, we established our values as expectations for the space and for the collaboration, and then began creating working groups. And so now we, for instance, have a decolonization working group that is predominantly, non-Native folks who are willing to push other white organizations and historically white-led organizations to confront the change and the evolution that they are far overdue for. And so, through that space, white folks have been able to teach white folks. And so that labor is not on us as indigenous peoples, and they've been able to establish decolonization audits, we're calling them, and coaching sessions to hold spaces for folks to work through, the white supremacy that all of us were raised in, but to begin to integrate indigenous values and frameworks into their organizations and into their boards, and to begin to doing their own labor and their own homework to be in better alignment and in better allyship to our indigenous organizations and the tribes that they are going to continue to deal with here on our native lands. So I think finding those opportunities is also really important.
Yeah, and I would add that it's also okay to say no to someone because it's important to recognize that sometimes we're not really in a space to be able to put ourselves in that situation where we're putting ourselves in way of possible harm and also making ourselves really vulnerable in those kinds of conversations. And sometimes it's just more harmful to us than what we deserve and what we're capable of. So I think, recognizing when to say no as well to those conversations, and that's okay.
We have just a few more minutes. If there's a quick question with a quick response, would anyone like to jump in? Anyone?
No question, Kristen, doesn't mean no thought.
Right.
Reflection.
Well, in the absence of the out loud questioning, and in respect for your time for reflection, I want to invite any of our speakers or anyone on the call if they'd like to offer a last word before we say our goodbyes and our thank yous.
No, I just want to say how important this conversation is. My class on Thursday was about climate change in the Caribbean, and we had a discussion around climate justice. And I just wish we were able to listen to this discussion before we had that discussion. But I'm really pleased with a mix of personal experience, beginning the lesson of beginning where you are in the space in which you are, and making a difference doesn't have to start when you go to university or graduate from university. It could start when you're in high school. It can start when you're at university, and it I think that's an important lesson, and just pushing home the message that climate change is intimately connected with long historical patterns of inequality. And you're right, it's not something that people like to talk about. The past is not the past. The past continues with us. So thank you guys so very much for this very rich discussion.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you especially to Andrea, to Ixchiú, and to Ruth for sharing so generously. I will just reiterate that this has been really rich. I think I personally have been in a lot of, especially Zoom programming in the last year, and this was very engaging. I definitely kind of felt like simultaneously lots of kind of chills at the terrifying reality of what's happening. And what we're doing, but also quite a lot of hope. I have really appreciated being able to sit with those two feelings. So thank you so much. I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation or a point on a continuum of conversations that are already happening, will continue to happen. So big thanks to CLACS and to Patsy Lewis. Thanks to the Watson Institute, to the Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative, and also thanks to Alex Zafario for helping us out with the tech today. So y'all enjoy the rest of your days and your evenings, and I hope to be in community with y'all again sometime soon. Thank you.